Chapter 1. The Meeting. Colin Fenton was lying on the bed in his hotel room, wishing that he was somewhere else. The window was open, and he could hear the constant sound of traffic outside. The hotel was in Brentwood, a small town in Essex, just beyond the eastern suburbs of London. Colin was in Brentwood to teach a computer software course to the administrative staff of a company called Sutton Chemicals. This kind of teaching was always dull, tedious work, and today, the first day of the course, it had been particularly dull and tedious. By the afternoon, Colin had been exhausted. Now it was good to lie on the bed in the semi-darkness. The evening air was cool and damp. Slowly, Colin got up off the bed and went to close the window. He stared out over the hotel car park towards the wide, busy street beyond, while he wondered where he could go to eat dinner. He had a shower and put on some casual clothes. He phoned his home in Bath, about 200 kilometres away to the west, but his wife wasn't in the house. Then Colin remembered that she had been going to travel to see some clients that afternoon. She'd probably had to work late. She often did. I'll phone her after dinner, he thought. Colin and his wife, Julie, were partners in business. Their company, CJF Software Solutions, developed computer programs and sold them to a number of large businesses. Colin looked after the company's finances, the marketing of the computer software, and the organization of training courses. Julie was a software developer. Colin left his hotel room and went to find somewhere to eat. The hotel didn't have a restaurant, but earlier in the day Colin had seen a pub which had a restaurant attached, just down the street. He decided to walk there. The food and wine were excellent. At last, Colin began to relax. So, after the meal, instead of going straight back to the hotel to have an early night, he went into the bar of the pub. It was noisy and crowded, but Colin didn't care about that. In one corner of the bar, there was a large television set. A football match was showing, and most of the customers were watching it. Colin bought a drink and tried to find an empty seat. As he was looking round the crowded room, he saw something that almost made him drop his glass. He walked towards a man who was standing at the other side of the bar. "For a moment I thought I was looking in a mirror," he said. The other man was shocked too. The two of them stood, facing each other. It was strange, unreal. Then they both laughed. The two men were unbelievably alike. They were both in their late 30s. They had almost identical features. They even had the same hairstyle. Colin was perhaps slightly heavier, but otherwise the two men were doubles. "We could be twin brothers," the other man said. They introduced themselves. The other man's name was John Bentley. He had a soft London accent. "There's a seat free at our table, if you'd like to join us," he said. "I must introduce you to my wife." Linda Bentley was sitting on a long seat in the corner farthest from the television. She moved along the seat to make room for Colin. "It's incredible," she said, looking at Colin and her husband. "You two are identical. You're perfect doubles." Linda was dressed in black clothes. She had fair hair, large green eyes, and a broad smile. She wore a lot of makeup, and she wore a lot of heavy gold jewellery. Her skirt, Colin noticed, was very short indeed. She could not have looked less like his own wife, but he liked the way she looked. "I've not seen you in here before, Colin," John Bentley said. "Where are you from?" "Bath," Colin said. "My wife and I own a small computer software company there." I'm in Brentwood for a couple of days, teaching a course. Oh, I don't know anything about computer software, Linda said. You must be very clever. She smiled at him, and Colin laughed. No, he said, my wife's the clever one. Colin enjoyed being with the Bentleys. He liked their friendly way of talking. Over the next hour, he drank more than he had planned to drink. As a result, he became very talkative. But after some time, he noticed that John Bentley had become silent. Bentley was probably bored with hearing him talk, Colin thought. But Linda kept asking him questions about his business. When it was time to leave the pub, Colin shook hands with the Bentleys, and they wished one another good night. "Will you be here in Brentwood again?" Linda asked Colin, as they walked out into the cool night air. "Yes, I will, actually," Colin said. "I've got another 2-day course to teach at Sutton Chemicals, in about a month's time." "Oh, so perhaps we'll be seeing each other again, then," she said. "That will be great." Her eyes opened wide with pleasure. "Yes," Colin said, "we must meet. I'd love to see you again, both of you." Colin turned into the street, and John and Linda Bentley walked towards a white van at the far side of the pub car park. "Good night, Colin," Linda called. As soon as Colin Fenton was out of sight, the Bentleys started arguing. John, who had drunk rather a lot of beer that evening, began to shout at his wife. "What did you think you were doing?" he yelled. "What's your game? Why were you flirting with that guy?" When he was angry, John Bentley sometimes became violent and hit his wife. But now some people were crossing the car park behind them, talking in loud voices and laughing. Linda knew her husband wouldn't hit her while there were people near. "Shut up," she said. "Give me the keys to the van." John ignored her and began opening the driver's door. She grabbed the keys from him and pushed him out of the way. She got into the driver's seat and waited for him to walk round to the passenger's side. He got slowly into the van. They were silent as she drove away from the pub, but after a minute, Linda touched her husband's hand. "Don't be an idiot, John," she said. John Bentley didn't reply. He just stared out of the window. They were driving along a wide road lined with shops. It had started to rain, and the street lamps were reflected on the wet road and pavements. Linda turned into a side street. "That guy will be useful to us. You'll see," she said. "That's why we must make sure that we see him again." John turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" he said. "You and he are identical, John," she said. "That's interesting, don't you think?" Her husband didn't understand her. A minute later, Linda slowed down and turned onto the drive in front of the garage of their small house. The van's headlights shone onto the garage door. "You can forget about small-time thieving now, John," Linda said. "If you do one big, easy robbery now, we'll be rich for the rest of our lives." "I'm going straight now, Linda," John said. "I'm finished with thieving. You know that. I don't want to go to prison again." "You won't go to prison this time," his wife replied quickly. "There's no way you'll get caught." When Colin Fenton got back to his hotel room, it was too late to phone his wife. "Oh, well," he thought, "I'll be back home in Bath tomorrow night anyway. It doesn't matter now." The idea of another day teaching the administrative staff of Sutton Chemicals was thoroughly tedious. He didn't want to think about it. He thought instead about Linda Bentley. The only good thing about coming back to Sutton Chemicals for another course was that he might get a chance to see her again. Chapter 2. The Business. It was a cold, wet Monday morning in late October, 2 weeks after Colin had taught the training course at Sutton Chemicals. The trees that lined the streets in Bath were bare. Dead leaves lay on the pavements. Colin shivered as he got into his car. He picked a cassette from a pile on the passenger seat, put it into the player, and started the car engine. A moment later, an old blues song was coming from the stereo. Colin and Julie always went to work in separate cars. They left home at different times in the mornings and arrived home at different times in the evenings. During the day, they hardly saw each other. They were busy with their own jobs. Both of them regularly travelled to see clients. Julie to sort out their technical problems, Colin to sell the software and teach training courses. But they rarely travelled together. Today was one of the rare days when they were both going to be in Bath all day. But before he went to the office, Colin had an appointment that he wasn't looking forward to. He drove to the eastern side of the city, parked his BMW, and hurried through the rain to a low office block. Outside one of the ground floor offices was a brass sign with the words, D.S.T. Booker, Accountant. Colin opened the door and walked in. A girl was working at a desk with 6 filing trays, a computer, and 2 telephones on it. "Mr. Booker's expecting me," Colin told her. "Yes, that's fine," the girl replied. "Please go through." Colin went through a door into another room. Mr. Booker was bent over his desk, reading some papers. He wore very thick glasses, and he held the papers close to his pale face. He looked like a man in pain. Colin sat down and pushed a folder of financial documents across the desk. Booker slowly raised his head, opened the folder, and glanced briefly through the documents. "You're going to lose money for the 2nd year running, Mr. Fenton," he said. "You've got to do something about this quickly, or you'll go out of business." "I know the situation isn't good at the moment," Colin replied. "We're short of cash, but the situation's only temporary." "Well," Booker said, "the facts are clear enough. This year you've earned around £40,000 so far. But last year you spent more than £150,000, and you'll spend more or less the same this year. Your business won't survive unless there are some large orders coming in soon." Colin was silent. He looked down at the floor. Booker leant forward. "And you haven't got any large orders coming in, have you?" he said. He seemed almost pleased. "We're developing some important new software for Jackman's, the big insurance brokers," Colin said. "It's for use at their head office in Manchester. It's a valuable contract." "Have you signed the contract already?" Booker asked. "Well, no, actually," Colin said. "The people at Jackman's are waiting for the results of some tests. We still have to sort out a few technical problems with the software, but in a few months everything will be ready." Booker smiled. "I see," he said. "Well, you'll need to earn about £20,000 between now and the end of the year if you want your company to survive." "I've arranged a loan at the bank," Colin said. Booker began collecting his papers. He stood up slowly. The accountant's body was stiff and his shoulders were bent. He took the papers from his desk and put them into a brown folder. Colin noticed that Booker's hands were trembling slightly as he put the folder into a filing cabinet. "Bank loans are trouble," Booker said, pushing the heavy drawer shut. "And you need real orders now, not possible orders in a few months' time. You need cash now, or you will go out of business." When Colin arrived at his own office, his wife was getting ready to leave. Julie had an appointment with a client on the other side of the city. Her desk was covered with papers, computer books, and floppy disks. She was sorting through them, putting what she needed into her briefcase. Julie saw Colin looking at her. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "You've been to see Booker this morning, haven't you? What did he say?" "Oh, nothing much," Colin said. "He just wanted me to take him some documents he needed." "Fine," Julie said. "Well, I'd better be going. I don't expect I'll be back here today. I'll see you at home tonight." Colin took off his jacket and sat at his desk. He looked through the glass partition between his and Julie's room and the main part of the office. Rob and Jenny, the two programmers, were busy at their computers. Near the door of the main office, Maggie was sitting at her desk. Maggie was the secretary, telephonist, and general office helper. She had been with Colin and Julie ever since they had started CJF Software Solutions 5 years before. Colin opened the letters that Maggie had put on his desk earlier in the morning. Among them was a letter from his bank manager. The letter explained the details of the bank loan that Colin had arranged the previous week. At the bottom of the pile of long business envelopes, there was a smaller envelope. Colin's name and the address of the company were handwritten neatly on it. Colin opened the envelope. The paper he pulled out smelt of perfume. "Dear Colin, you'll probably be surprised to get a letter from me. I found your company's address in the Yellow Pages. I just wanted to remind you that we'd love to see you when you next come to Brentwood. I think you said you would be here again in a few weeks' time. Perhaps this time you could have dinner with us at our house. We really enjoyed that evening we spent together. Your funny stories made us laugh so much. Please phone me on 0033 23456 before your next visit, so that we can arrange to meet. Hoping to see you again soon. Best wishes, Linda Bentley." Colin held the letter close to his face. The perfume was the one which Linda Bentley had been wearing that Wednesday night in the pub in Brentwood. Colin didn't know what to think about the letter. What did Linda mean by "your funny stories"? He had talked a lot that evening, but he couldn't remember telling any funny stories. Well, not many, anyway. The letter could be embarrassing for him, Colin thought. He didn't want Julie to see it. He quickly read through the letter again, and he noticed that the number was for a mobile phone. He tore off the part of the letter with the phone number on it and put the piece of paper in his wallet. He tore the rest of the letter into small pieces and put them into the waste paper bin beside his desk. Chapter 3. The Plan. Linda Bentley was 33 years old, and she was good-looking. She was used to getting what she wanted. She had made an important decision very early in her life. Since there was no one to look after her, she would make sure that she looked after herself. Linda had been born in Glasgow, the largest city in Scotland. She had no brothers or sisters, and she didn't know who her father was. Until she was 12, Linda had lived with her mother in a damp, dark flat. The flat had a bedroom, which was the living room too, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. Linda's mother usually went out in the evenings, leaving her alone. Sometimes her mother brought men home with her, and then she told Linda to sleep on the floor in the kitchen. When she was 12, Linda's mother disappeared, and after that, Linda never saw her again. She didn't know where her mother had gone or what had happened to her, and she didn't care. An aunt and uncle took Linda into their home, and they tried to love her and care for her. But the girl no longer understood what love was. As soon as she was 18 years old, she left Glasgow and went south to London. She found a job in a pub called the Red Lion in Ilford, in East London. That was where she met John Bentley. John was a likeable young man, and a good-looking one. He was an orphan, so he and Linda had something in common. But Linda had learnt to look after herself, and John had not. So Linda tried to look after him. He was working as a lorry driver at that time, and he always seemed to have plenty of money. He spent a lot of it on presents for Linda. She enjoyed getting the presents, and she didn't ask where the money came from. A year after their first meeting, John and Linda got married. When, a few months later, John was sent to prison, Linda found out where his money had been coming from. Now she was alone in London, but there was no point in going back to Glasgow. Her aunt and uncle had moved to Spain, so Linda decided to stay in London and wait for John. But she needed a change, so she started looking for a new job. She soon found one in a large jewellery shop in a fashionable part of London. The shop was called Sandwell's. Linda's job there was much better paid than the work in the pub, and it was much more pleasant too. When John Bentley came out of prison, he was determined to stay away from his old friends. He decided to go straight. He had hated being locked in a cell for most of each day, and he didn't want to go back to prison. Linda persuaded Mr. Rose, the manager at Sandwell's, to give her husband a job. The manager knew about John's time in prison, but he gave the young man a chance to live an honest life. Later that year, John and Linda moved into the small rented house near Brentwood, where they still lived. Early one evening, a few weeks after she'd sent the letter to Colin, Linda Bentley was in her kitchen, preparing a meal. As she put some fish into a large pan, her mobile phone began to ring. She quickly wiped her hands and put the phone to her ear. John was in the living room, watching television. He couldn't hear Linda's conversation. "So you'll be in Brentwood next week," Linda said. "That's great, Colin. How long will you be staying?" "2 nights," Colin said. "We could meet on Wednesday or Thursday evening." Linda thought for a moment. "Wednesday will be best for me," she said. "Can we meet in the same pub at around 6:30? Then later you can come here for a meal with us." "Yes, that's fine. I'll see you next Wednesday then," Colin said. Linda switched her phone off and put it in her handbag. She smiled to herself. Wednesday was certainly the best day for what she had in mind. John would be away from home that night. Soon the fish was ready. Linda switched off the cooker and turned round with the pan in her hand. John was standing in the kitchen doorway. "I just heard your phone ring," he said. "Who are you talking to?" "No one," Linda replied. "Somebody called a wrong number." She lifted the pieces of fish onto 2 plates and added some vegetables. "Sit down and eat this while it's hot," she said. On the evening of the following Tuesday, Colin Fenton left his home in Bath and travelled to Brentwood. He booked into the same hotel, ready to start work early in the morning. The next evening, after a day spent with the administrative staff at Sutton Chemicals, he was beginning to regret his agreement to meet the Bentleys. He was tired, and he decided to phone them to say he couldn't meet them after all. But when he looked at his watch, he saw that it was too late. It was almost 6 o'clock already, and he had agreed to meet his friends at the pub at 6:30. He would have to go to the pub, eat his meal at their home as quickly as he could, and leave early. This time the pub wasn't crowded. There was no football on the television, and the bar was nearly empty. A few people were sitting at tables, drinking and talking. Linda Bentley was waiting for him, sitting on her own at a table in a corner. She had a glass of orange juice in front of her. Colin walked across the room towards her. She stood up and shook his hand. "Hello," she said. "I'm glad you could come." She was wearing a black dress made of shiny material. It was tight-fitting and very short. "It's good to see you, Linda," Colin said. "Can I get you another drink?" "No, it's okay, thanks. I haven't finished this yet," she replied, touching her glass. "What about John?" Colin said, looking round the room. "Where is he?" "I'm afraid it's just you and me tonight," Linda said. "John can't come. He's driven his van to Liverpool with some mates." "Liverpool?" Colin said, surprised. "Yes, they've gone to a football match," Linda replied. "John's football mad. He supports West Ham United. He goes to watch all their matches. West Ham are playing Liverpool Football Club tonight." "You should have sent me a message," Colin said. "We could have met another time." Linda smiled at him. "I wanted to see you tonight, John." "Go and get yourself a drink," she said. After a few drinks, they left the pub, and Linda drove them back to her house in her red Ford Escort. Everything was ready for dinner. There was a small vase of flowers in the middle of the table, and a glass bowl full of water on which candles floated. While Linda finished preparing the food, Colin looked at the framed photographs on the sideboard in the living room. They were mostly pictures of John and Linda on holiday in various places. But one photograph showed an elderly couple, sitting in a sunny Mediterranean garden. Colin picked it up and looked at it. Linda came into the room, carrying a tray of pasta and salad. Colin pointed to the photo. "Your parents?" he asked. "No, my aunt and uncle," Linda replied. "But they were like parents to me. They looked after me when I was a teenager in Glasgow. My uncle is dead now, but my aunt still lives in Spain. It's too cold and wet for her in Scotland." "Do you see your aunt often?" asked Colin. "No, I haven't seen her for years. John doesn't like the heat in Spain," Linda replied, laughing. "But we might go to see her soon." They spent the next couple of hours eating, laughing, and getting to know each other. Colin was soon feeling much better, and he was glad that he had come. Suddenly, he found himself looking straight into Linda's large green eyes. She smiled at him and looked down at the table, pretending to be embarrassed. It was late when they finished their meal. Then they sat in armchairs drinking coffee. After the second cup, Linda leant back in her chair and said calmly, "Colin, do you want to earn £10,000 for one evening's easy work?" This simple question took Colin completely by surprise. He'd been expecting a proposal, but a very different one. He laughed. "I don't buy lottery tickets," he said. "I'm serious, Colin," Linda said, "and I'm not talking about buying lottery tickets." She got up and came to sit on the floor next to his chair. She smiled at him and touched his hand. "I'm talking about £10,000 in cash. It's yours, if you want it." Colin sat up straight and removed Linda's hand from his own hand. "What's going on?" he said nervously. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing, Colin," she said quickly. "I was joking." She stood up. "Let's have some more coffee." "You weren't joking," Colin said. "You'd better tell me what this is about." "You're right. I wasn't joking," she replied. "But I'm not sure that I should tell you. Perhaps I've made a mistake." Colin finished his coffee and stood up. "Okay, you'd better take me back to my hotel," he said. "It really is late. It's past midnight." Colin got up and went into the hall to get his coat. When he came back into the living room, Linda Bentley's eyes were wet, and tears were running down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Colin," she said. She cried quietly. Colin put his arms around her and held her for a moment. Then he kissed the tears on her cheeks and stroked her hair. "It's all right, Linda," he said. Linda stopped crying and pulled herself away from him. "You must think I'm very stupid," she said. "I'll get my coat and take you back to your hotel. I'm so sorry I spoilt a lovely evening." She went into the hall and took her coat from a cupboard. Colin followed her. When she turned round, Colin was right behind her. He took the coat from her and dropped it on the floor. She looked at him, her eyes wide open. Colin held her arms, pulled her very close to him, and kissed her on the mouth. "You can take me back to the hotel early tomorrow morning," he said. "The evening's not spoilt at all." Early next morning, Colin and Linda had some coffee and toast together. Then Linda drove Colin back to his hotel. It was only 7:15, and the roads were clear. It was a cold, sunny morning. They talked about what each of them was going to do during the day, but they both knew they were avoiding talking about the previous night. Suddenly, they both became silent. Colin stared out of the window. They were driving past trees that were white with frost. Colin turned and looked at Linda. At last, Linda smiled at him and spoke. "What are you thinking about, Colin?" she asked. "It was a strange evening, wasn't it?" he replied. Linda nodded. "You planned it all, didn't you?" Colin said. "Do you mind if I did?" she asked. Colin thought for a moment. "No, I don't think I do," he said. Then he added, "And what about the £10,000? You were serious about that, weren't you?" They had reached Colin's hotel. Linda drove onto the car park and switched off the car engine. "My husband is going to need an alibi," she said. "You can provide one for him. It's as simple as that." "What do you mean?" "You and John are identical. All you have to do is pretend to be John for a night." "While John does a robbery, am I right?" "Right." "What's he going to steal?" "I can't tell you that." "Linda, I need to know," Colin said. "It won't be an armed robbery, will it? Nobody will carry a gun." "No one will get killed or hurt, Colin." "What's the plan?" Colin asked. "Is John going to rob a bank?" "No," Linda said, "and you don't need to know any more about it." "Yes, I do, Linda," Colin insisted. "I have to know what risk I'll be taking. I don't want anybody to get hurt, and I don't want to spend years of my life in prison." Linda thought for a moment. "All right, Colin," she said. "I'll tell you the plan. John and I work in a jewellery shop. We know all about the security systems there. John will be able to get inside the shop at night without setting off the alarm. He'll smash a window and set off the alarm as he's leaving. We hope that the police will think it's an ordinary break-in. But John has a criminal record, and the police might suspect him if he doesn't have an alibi. He'll need a really good alibi. You can provide him with it." "I understand," Colin said. "When do you plan to do this?" "We haven't chosen a date yet. We can make our plans fit with yours," Linda replied. "You travel a lot because of your work. You told us that. One day, when you're somewhere a long way from London, you can stay in a hotel using John's name. That will give John a perfect alibi, and only the three of us will ever know how the robbery was done." "You've planned this all very carefully, haven't you?" "When I want something, I make sure I get it," Linda said. Colin thought about the previous evening. "Yes, you do," he agreed in a cold voice. "What about the money? The £10,000? "We can pay you a few thousand in advance," Linda said. "You'll get the rest soon after the robbery." "I might be able to help you, but I need some time to think about this," said Colin. "OK," Linda said. "You've got my phone number." "I'll be in touch," said Colin. He got out of the car and watched Linda drive away. Then he went up to his room to get the things he needed for his day at Sutton Chemicals. Chapter 4. The Journey. A few weeks later, Linda Bentley got the phone call she had been expecting. She was hurrying back to the jewellery shop after her lunch break. It was nearly Christmas, and the London streets were crowded with shoppers. Linda's mobile phone rang inside her bag. She opened her bag and lifted the phone to her ear. She heard Colin say, "All right. I'll do it." "Good. I knew you would," she replied. "We'll need a few weeks to get everything ready." "That's fine," Colin said. "I'll be in Manchester in about 4 weeks' time. That'll be the second week in January. We can arrange John's alibi for then." "Phone me again next week, Colin," Linda said. "We'll fix the dates and times then." Linda put her phone back inside her handbag and smiled. She pushed her way through the crowds, and she ran down some steps into an underground station. Her only problem now was to tell John about the plan. Her husband still knew nothing about her second meeting with Colin Fenton. That evening, the Bentleys were sitting in their kitchen eating dinner. John had a newspaper on the table, and he was reading the sports pages while he ate. Linda put her hand on his arm. "John, do you remember our friend Colin?" she said. "Who?" John said, not looking up. "You know, the guy who looks just like you," Linda said. "What about him?" John turned the page of the newspaper and folded it. "He's agreed to give you an alibi." Linda stood up and carried her plate to the sink, so that she did not have to look at John. John put the newspaper down and pushed his chair back. "When did you speak to him?" he said. "A couple of weeks ago," Linda said, filling the sink with water. "I met him in the pub. He was teaching a course at that chemical company." "Was that when I was in Liverpool?" Linda knew that John was angry and jealous. She didn't answer him. "You waited for me to be out of the way," John shouted. "I expect you had a great time together, didn't you? Come on, answer me." Linda heard a plate smash against the tiled floor. "What was it? Dinner in the pub? Or did you come back here for dinner? And what else did you come back here for?" John was furious. He stood up suddenly, and his chair fell back and hit the floor. Linda cried out in pain as John grabbed her arms and began shaking her. "I don't need an alibi," John shouted. "No alibi. Forget it. I told you before, I'm not going to rob the shop. I'm going straight now." Linda was screaming with pain. She pushed her husband with all her strength. John crashed into the kitchen table and then fell hard against the wall, hitting his head against it with a loud crack. Linda turned, breathing fast. She stared at the blood stain on the white wall. Below it, John was lying on the floor, holding his head.
"Don't you ever do that to me again!" Linda shouted.
She left him there and went upstairs to wash. Her arms ached, and she could hardly move them. Where John had grabbed her, there were 2 large, dark bruises on her skin. Linda went to the bedroom, got into bed, and closed her eyes. After some time, she heard John moving about downstairs, cleaning up in the kitchen. Later, she heard him come up the stairs, go to the bathroom, and have a shower. When he got into the bed, he didn't speak to her, but he didn't go to sleep. After half an hour, Linda said quietly, "We mustn't waste any time, John. Tomorrow you'd better go and see Frankie Simpson at the Red Lion. Talk to him about the jewellery. He'll fence it for us. Don't tell him where you're getting it. Just tell him you want him to sell more than £1 million worth of jewellery. Okay?" John didn't answer.
"Okay,"
Linda repeated. "Okay," John said at last. Towards the end of December, Colin made the final arrangements with Linda. The date for the robbery was arranged for the 10th of January. Now that all the plans were made, Colin suddenly understood the risk he was taking. But he tried not to worry, telling himself that it was only an exciting game. After all, the money he was going to be paid would save his company. Colin and Julie spent the Christmas holidays visiting Julie's brother and his family in Devon. No one noticed that Colin was a little quieter than usual. One morning in early January, Colin and Julie were in the office together, talking about the big project at Jackman's, the insurance brokers. Julie was still testing the software, but that morning the Fentons were discussing a report that Julie had just given Colin. The report was full of charts showing the results of the latest tests. "These figures look good, Julie," Colin said. "When I show the people at Jackman's these charts, I'm sure they'll be very impressed. I'm going to see Jim Slater in Manchester next week. It should be easy to convince him to purchase the software now." "I'd better come with you," Julie said. "There'll be technical details to discuss." "I can do that," Colin said. "Leave it with me." "No, Colin," Julie said. "I should be in Manchester with you. You know how fussy Slater is about details. We've got to do this properly. Jackman's could become our biggest client." Colin stood up and looked out of the window. He was thinking quickly. He couldn't allow Julie to come to Manchester with him, not this time. He turned round and said, "I'll just have preliminary talks with Slater. We won't discuss the details this time. Of course you'll be with me when we have that discussion. I've already fixed this appointment, so I'll go alone this time. Anyway, I've got other people to visit up in the Manchester area. I'll be away for a couple of days." "You should have spoken to me first, Colin," Julie said. "You shouldn't have arranged an appointment before seeing my report on the latest tests." "Slater phoned me, Julie. The meeting was his idea," Colin said. He was surprised at how easy it was for him to lie. "Slater asked to see me, so I fixed it with him." On Tuesday, the 10th of January, Colin worked at the office in Bath all day. Then, at about 5:30, he went home to pack his suitcase for the trip to Manchester. He changed into casual clothes, jeans, sweater, and an old sports jacket. He didn't want to look like a businessman when he arrived at his hotel later that evening. He wanted to look like John Bentley. He was ready to leave his house by 6 o'clock. He put his mobile phone in one of the pockets of his jacket. As he stepped out of the house and walked towards his car, he felt an icy wind on his face. Fine, powdery snow blew across the drive. Colin put his case in the boot of his BMW, got into the car, and started the engine. Instead of driving towards the M5, the quickest route to Manchester, Colin made his way to the M4 and turned east towards London. He stopped at a service area near Swindon to buy petrol and have a quick cup of tea. He was hungry, but there was no time to eat. The motorway was quite busy, and the snow was falling faster. It was nearly 8 o'clock when Colin reached the last exit before the M4 crosses the M25, the motorway that circles London. He left the M4, and a few minutes later he drove into a lay-by off a small road. He saw the Bentley's red Ford Escort waiting there, and he parked next to it. He got out into the snow and the freezing air and approached the other car. Linda Bentley opened one of the rear doors for him to get in. He sat beside her. "Exactly on time," Linda said. Colin nodded. Then he said hello to John Bentley, who was sitting in the driver's seat. Linda handed Colin her husband's driving licence. "What's this for?" Colin asked. "You may need it," Linda said. "The alibi must be perfect. If you're stopped by the police, you must show them John's documents, not your own. We can't take any risks. What if there's an accident? We'll need your licence too, for the same reason." Colin took his driving licence from his pocket and gave it to Linda. "What about my money?" he said. Linda took out a thick envelope from her bag and handed it to Colin. "That's £5,000 in £20 notes," she said. "Count it." Colin did. "Right," Linda said. "Did you book a hotel room in Manchester as John Bentley?" Again Colin nodded. "Good. Phone us at about 11:30 when you get to the hotel. Once we know that you've arrived and that the alibi's okay, we can get moving. Is everything clear?" "Yes," Colin said. "Okay, get your case," Linda said. They all got out of the Bentley's car. Colin opened the boot of his own car and took out his case. Colin and John exchanged car keys. "We'll meet here at the same time on Thursday," Linda said. "You'll get your car and driving licence back then, and you'll get the rest of your money, too." She smiled briefly. "We'll wait for your call at about 11:30 tonight, then." "Yes, fine," Colin said. Colin watched while John and Linda drove off in his BMW. He put the envelope of money safely in an inside pocket of his suitcase and zipped the pocket closed. He put the case in the boot of the Escort, then he got into the driving seat. He started the engine and drove back towards the motorway. A few minutes later, he was driving along the M4 towards the junction with the M25. Chapter 5. The Accident. The M25 was very busy, and the traffic moved very slowly indeed. Colin didn't need to stay on that motorway for long, because he was driving to the junction with the M40. He hoped to make better progress when he turned onto the M40 and started to drive northwest towards Birmingham. But instead, the traffic on the M40 was even worse than on the M25. Roadworks and the high winds and heavy snow reduced the traffic speed to less than 50 kilometers per hour. Time was passing, and Colin began to wonder whether he could reach Manchester that night. He decided that the only thing to do was to leave the motorway at the next exit and drive on smaller roads north towards Birmingham. Beyond Birmingham, he could join the M6, which he hoped would be less busy, and drive to Manchester on that. As soon as he left the M40, Colin was sure he had made the right decision. After a few minutes, he was racing along quiet country roads. Then the accident happened. It was just after 9 o'clock. The road in front of him was clear, and Colin put his foot down on the accelerator. There were no streetlights, and the night was very dark. High hedges and tall trees lined the road. Beyond the hedges, The fields seemed black. The narrow road curved sharply ahead. Colin turned his steering wheel, but suddenly the car was out of control. It spun round, rolled over, then crashed into a huge tree by the side of the road. Another car had been following the red Escort for several miles, a blue Volvo. The car's driver witnessed the accident. Mark Ashwood slowed down as he watched the car spin and roll over. When it hit the tree, there was a dreadful noise of tearing metal and breaking glass. Mark stopped his car behind the wrecked Escort. Leaving his engine running and turning his headlights full on, he jumped out of his car and hurried towards the wreck. The road, he noticed, was covered in ice. The accident looked serious. The car lay on its roof. The Escort was a mass of torn metal. Broken glass lay on the icy road and on the snow-covered grass by the side of the road. The front of the car was against the trunk of the tree. There seemed no hope for the driver. Mark looked inside the wrecked car. A man was trapped in the driver's seat, the steering wheel pressing into his chest. He was still alive. Mark could hear him groaning quietly. Mark pulled at the twisted metal that had been the driver's door, but it would not move. Cutting equipment would be needed to free the injured man. Mark tried to think what to do. He was a long way from a phone box, and he was not carrying a mobile. He didn't want to leave the injured man alone, but he could do nothing to free him without help. After a minute, Mark heard a lorry approaching. He stood in the middle of the road, waving his arms. The lorry stopped, and the driver looked out of the cab. He saw the wreckage and shook his head. "Will you drive to a phone box, please?" Mark shouted to him. "This is an emergency." "There's no need, mate," the lorry driver called back. "I've got a mobile phone." "Then please, phone for the emergency services quickly. There's a man trapped in there. We'll need a fire crew and an ambulance, as well as the police." While the lorry driver was phoning, Mark went back to the injured man. After half a minute, the lorry driver called down from his cab. "An ambulance is on its way," he said. "Do you need my help here?" "There's nothing you can do. I'll wait till help arrives." "Then I'll move on. I'm blocking the road with the lorry." As the lorry moved slowly away, Mark looked inside the wrecked car again. The injured man was trying to speak. Mark could hear him through the broken glass of the driver's window. "Don't try to talk. Help is coming," Mark said. "You'll soon be out of there." There was blood on the man's face. He looked about the same age as Mark himself, somewhere in his mid-30s. "Julie," the man said. "Julian? Is that your name?" "No. Please tell Julie," the man said slowly. It was difficult for him to breathe. "Tell her I'm sorry. I've been so stupid. Tell her, will you? Please tell Julie I'm sorry." "Your wife?" "Yes, Julie, my wife," the injured man said. "I want her to know the truth." "The truth about what?" Mark asked. The man coughed. Blood came from his mouth and ran down his face. In a moment, he was unconscious. The ambulance and the fire engine arrived together. They stopped beside the wreckage of the Escort, their blue lights flashing. The fire crew began cutting at the wreckage and pulling away bits of torn and twisted metal. In a few minutes, they had removed part of the side of the car. Soon, 2 paramedics were beside the injured driver, trying to get him out of the wreck. As they worked, they spoke quietly to each other. A police car arrived a minute later. 2 officers got out. The male driver walked over to the wreck, and the other officer, a woman, came to talk to Mark. He briefly described what he'd seen to the young policewoman. "Was he going fast?" she asked him. "Yes, too fast, I suppose," Mark said. "And the road is icy here on the bend. He just spun round and lost control. His car rolled over and over. I was fairly close behind him. I suppose I was going too fast, too. It's lucky I didn't crash into him." At that moment, the paramedics managed to get the driver out of the wrecked car. They lifted him carefully and laid him on a stretcher on the ground. The man groaned once more. Then he was silent. Mark and the policewoman moved closer to them. One of the paramedics looked up. He shook his head. "He's gone. There was no hope," he said quietly. Mark looked at the dead body on the stretcher. He felt both sad and angry. He realized he was trembling. The man's death had shocked him. It seemed so unnecessary. Somewhere the man's wife, Julie, was waiting for him, not knowing what had happened. And perhaps they had children. The paramedics put the body in the back of the ambulance. "Come to the car, sir," the policewoman said to Mark. She took him by the arm. They sat inside the police car. Mark told the policewoman again about everything that he had seen and gave her his name and address. She wrote his words down in her notebook. Soon the ambulance was ready to leave. The paramedics closed the back doors and climbed into the front seats. The ambulance drove away slowly. The other officer returned to the police car. He sat in the driver's seat. He spoke quietly to his colleague. "A breakdown truck is coming to take away the wreckage," he said. Then he turned and spoke to Mark. "You look a bit pale, sir. Are you all right to continue your journey?" "Yes, I'm fine," Mark said. He was silent for a moment. Then he added, "I need to speak to that poor man's wife." "Don't worry, sir," the policewoman said. "We'll take care of that." Mark thought about the driver's wife getting a visit from the police late at night. He tried to imagine how she would feel. "Yes, of course," he said slowly. "But I was the last person to speak to the man. I saw the accident happen. If his wife knows how the accident happened, perhaps it will help her. Can you give me the man's name and address?" "We can't do that, sir," the policeman said. "The man's relatives will have to identify the body first." "But I must speak to his wife," Mark said. "Before he died, he gave me a message for her. It was important to him, and it might help his wife accept his death." The policewoman spoke quietly to her colleague. "He could phone me in a few days," she said. "The identification will have been made by then." The policeman nodded. "Okay," he said. The woman wrote down her name and phone number and gave it to Mark. "You can get in touch with me at this number on Monday morning. I should be able to tell you the man's name and address then." Mark folded the piece of paper and put it inside his wallet. "Thanks," he said. "We'll need you to call at the police station in Thame in the next day or two, sir," the policewoman said. "You were the only witness to the accident. We'll need you to sign a statement. You'll probably have to attend the inquest, too." "Yes, of course," said Mark. "I'd better go now." "Okay, sir," the policewoman said. "Drive carefully." As Mark drove away, he saw a breakdown truck approaching. Chapter 6. The News. While her husband was dying on an icy road in Oxfordshire, Julie Fenton was in her comfortable home in the city of Bath. She was sitting in the living room with a magazine in her hands. Music was playing quietly on the stereo. Listening to music was Julie's way of relaxing. She had tried to interest Colin in classical music, but Colin always preferred blues and jazz. Julie wasn't reading the magazine she was holding, and this evening the music didn't help her relax. She was worrying about a technical problem she'd been having with the new software for Jackman's, and she was angry with her husband. Colin had said that he would phone her from his hotel in Manchester. It was typical of him that he'd forgotten. No doubt when he came home again in a few days' time, he'd have a good excuse for not phoning. He usually had good excuses. At 11:30, Julie yawned and put her magazine down. She looked at the phone, hoping it would ring, but it didn't. She switched off the stereo and went to bed. In Brentwood, Linda and John Bentley were getting nervous. They sat quietly, listening to the sound of the kitchen clock ticking. John had everything ready for the robbery. He was wearing black clothes, and in his jacket pocket was a gun. On the chair next to him there was a sports bag with some equipment inside. Suddenly he stood up and started to walk nervously round the room. "What's happened? Why hasn't Fenton phoned?" he said. "Don't worry, he's been delayed, that's all," Linda said. John sat down again. He looked at the clock. It was now almost midnight. The agreed time for Colin's call had been 11:30. Soon it would be time for them to leave for Sandwell's. They heard a car stop outside the house. John lifted a curtain and looked through the window into the dark street. Immediately he let the curtain fall again and stood back from the window. "It's the police," he said. "What's that guy done, Linda? What's his game? Has he told the police about our plan?" "Go upstairs," Linda said. "Keep out of the way. We've done nothing wrong. There's nothing to worry about." John grabbed his sports bag and ran upstairs. He hid in the bedroom at the back of the house. A moment later, the doorbell rang. Linda went to the front door and opened it. 2 police officers were standing in the doorway. One of the officers was a woman. "Mrs. Bentley?" the policewoman said. "Yes. We're very sorry to disturb you at this time of night, but—" The policewoman was silent for a moment. "I'm sorry," she went on. "May we come in?" "Yes, of course." They went into the living room and sat down. "It's about your husband, Mrs. Bentley," the policewoman said. "I'm afraid he's had an accident." Linda opened her mouth, but no words came out. The policewoman touched her hand. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Bentley," the policewoman said, "but your husband died earlier this evening. His car crashed on an icy road near Thame in Oxfordshire." Linda looked down at the floor. This was terrible news. She'd never imagined that this could happen. She heard the policewoman say, "I'm afraid you'll have to identify your husband's body." "Yes, of course," Linda said, looking up at last. "A police car will collect you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. When the police had gone, John came downstairs. Linda was in the kitchen making tea. She poured the boiling water into the pot. John stood in the doorway. "Well," he said, "what did they want?" "It's Colin," she said. "He's had a car accident. He's dead." "What did you tell the police?" John asked. "Nothing," Linda said.
What could I tell them? What happens now?
John asked.
Be quiet. I must think,
Linda replied. A few minutes later, Linda was calm again. She poured the tea into 2 mugs and put them on the table. She sat down next to her husband.
Everything's changed now, John, she said. But it's good. Everyone will think you're dead, not Colin Fenton. We've got to make sure that they go on thinking that.
We can't do that, John said.
The police will find out. And what about Fenton's wife? She'll soon start looking for him.
But she won't find him, will she? Linda said.
There'll be a funeral in this area for someone called John Bentley. Why would anybody connect that with the disappearance from Bath of a man called Fenton? What about me?
You'll have to stay hidden for a while, Linda replied.
Then, when the funeral is over and everything's quiet again, you'll do the robbery just as we planned. After that, we'll get away to Spain. It'll be all right, you'll see.
They drank their tea in silence. Then Linda said,
Tomorrow I'm going to be busy. The police are coming to collect me at 10 o'clock. I've got to go to Oxford to identify your body. All you have to do is keep quiet in here. You'll have to stay in the back bedroom with the curtains closed. If anyone sees or hears you, we're finished. Is that clear?
This is madness, John said.
Just do as I say, John, and everything will be all right,
Linda said again. Chapter 7. The Wife. When Mark Ashwood got home to his small house in Stratford-upon-Avon, he was exhausted. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. Mark had had a long, tiring day. Mark was an accountant and a business consultant. He helped other business people with their tax problems and gave small companies advice on how to improve their profits and save money. That day, he had been to London to see a new client who owned a small clothing factory and who wanted advice on exporting his products. Mark didn't know a lot about exporting, but he couldn't refuse an important new client. He would have to learn more about the export regulations before his next meeting with the man. Mark quickly ate some bread and cheese, then he went upstairs. One of the 2 bedrooms in his house was furnished as an office. He switched on the desk lamp and sat down. His desk was tidy, as always. Pens and pencils were standing in a plastic holder. Mark pulled his copies of the Department of Trade and Industry's export regulations from a bookshelf. Although it was late, he began to look through the thick books. He tried to concentrate, but he couldn't stop thinking about the man who had died earlier in the evening. "Tell Julie I'm sorry," the man had said. Mark didn't like the idea much, but he knew that he would have to visit Julie. He knew that he would have to carry out the dying man's last wish. The following afternoon, Julie Fenton was working in her office in Bath when she had a phone call from Manchester. Jim Slater at Jackman's was wondering where Colin was. He had not appeared for their meeting that morning. Did Julie know if anything was wrong? Julie was embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she told Slater. "My husband left for Manchester yesterday. I can't think why he hasn't arrived. He may have been delayed at another client's office, but I'm sure he would have phoned you." "Well, as soon as you hear from him, please ask him to contact me," Slater said.
"Of course,"
Julie replied. She put the phone down. She was furious. What did Colin think he was doing?
Jackmans were such important clients. Julie dialed the number of Colin's mobile phone, but she couldn't make contact. Colin had probably switched the phone off, she thought. There was no news of Colin for the rest of the afternoon. Julie worked in the office until 6:30, testing a new computer program that she was writing. She tried calling Colin's mobile phone several times more, but she could never make contact. "Where the hell is he?" Julie said to herself. As Julie turned off her computer, Maggie, the company's secretary, was putting her coat on and getting ready to leave the office. "I hope Colin's all right," she said. "It's strange that he hasn't called." "Perhaps I should phone his hotel," Julie replied. "It's past 6:30 now. He may have returned to his room. What's the hotel number, Maggie?" Maggie looked a little embarrassed. "I'm afraid I don't know which hotel Colin's staying at," she said. "Normally he asks me to make his hotel reservations for him, but this time he said he'd already done it himself. I didn't think to ask him which hotel it was." "Well, we'll just have to wait for him to contact us then," Julie said. She was tired now, as well as angry. It was typical of Colin to be so thoughtless. She switched off her desk lamp and put on her coat. "I've done enough for one day," she said to Maggie. "I'm going home too." As the evening passed, Julie's anger changed to worry, and then to fear. Colin still hadn't got in touch. Julie began to think that something terrible might have happened. She went to bed, but she slept badly, expecting the telephone to ring at any time. But the phone didn't ring. In the morning, she got up feeling tired and miserable. She had to do something. She picked up the telephone and dialed the local police station. "Good morning," she said. "I want to report a missing person." Half an hour later, a police car drove up to the house. Julie opened the front door and took the two officers, a woman and a young man, into the living room. "When exactly did your husband go missing, Mrs. Fenton?" the policeman asked as they all sat down. "He went away on a business trip 2 days ago," Julie began, "but he failed to appear at the meeting he'd arranged, and I haven't heard from him at all since he left. I'm very worried about him." "Of course," said the policeman. "Does your husband often travel on business?" "Yes, he goes away about once a month." "Has he ever failed to come home before?" Julie hesitated. "No," she said finally. "You don't seem certain." "Well, there have been a couple of times when he has stayed away from home," Julie said. "But those times were different. We had had arguments, and he was angry with me, but he didn't stay away long, and he never missed business meetings." "I see," the policeman said. "And when was the last time this happened, Mrs. Fenton?" "About 3 years ago." "And there was no argument this time?" "No," Julie said. The police officers asked for Colin Fenton's personal details: his age, his description, what clothes he had been wearing when Julie had last seen him, and they asked what type of car he drove and its registration number. Julie took the police officers to the front door. "We'll tell you if we hear anything, of course," the policewoman said. "But I must warn you, Mrs. Fenton, if your husband doesn't want to return, that's not a matter for the police. If he has abandoned you, that isn't a crime. The police can do nothing to help you." "I understand that," Julie answered. The police officers walked back to their car, and Julie closed the door. She felt miserable and alone. She went to the kitchen and made a drink. Then she had a shower and put on fresh clothes, ready to go to the office. It was going to be another busy day.